Hello again, everyone, and thanks for joining us. This is our weekly vulnerability analysis from the Virsec Security Lab, where we analyze some top serious vulnerabilities that we have curated out of the thousands that come up every week. Joined as always by Satya Gupta, our founder and CTO. Hello, Satya, how are you?
Hello, Willie, how are you doing?
So it continues to be, I guess the new normal is huge numbers of vulnerabilities we're discovering, or more than the past. So maybe you can give us the overview of where we are, and then we'll dig into our usual list of, I think, 7 this week.
Yes. So let me share my screen here. All right. So as you mentioned, there were, we had like 361 vulnerabilities this week, so a little bit lighter for some reason. But I noticed there were 136 vulnerabilities that were reported on various Oracle products, mostly the WebLogic product line. It feels like it's falling apart here, but so there's about 136 vulnerabilities is very unusual for a week, unless they've been holding back and releasing them as a bunch, so that their customers can get patched. So we also found that there were 58 vulnerabilities that were reported on various Cisco products. That's a pretty large number too. And then there's 33 from Qualcomm Snapdragon product line. That, as you know, the Snapdragon is used in almost every phone. So, suddenly, your phone could become vulnerable, from these vulnerabilities. But what we've done this week, really, is that we've picked up 7 high-impact vulnerabilities that are reported in, various types of products. I picked 1 or 2 from WebLogic, and 1 or 2 from Oracle WebLogic, and 1 or 2 from Cisco. But there's others that have very high impact. 2 that I've picked out are related to the Kubernetes and the Docker, platforms. And the reason I picked out those is, there's a general belief that Kubernetes and Docker make your environment safe. But some of these vulnerabilities are command injection style vulnerabilities that can totally make your Docker and your entire environment vulnerable in one go.
Okay, great. And as always, we can't go through every single one of the 300 plus, but we picked some, I guess, not highlights, lowlights here, or ones that deserve specific attention. All right, great. So let's jump into it.
So the first one that we have is a Kubernetes Java client. And what that does is basically it connects to the remote. Every pod has a client sitting in it. If your client becomes vulnerable to a command injection or a path traversal or any RC kind of thing, your box becomes vulnerable. So this one is a path traversal vulnerability that typically results in exposure data, exposing data, but it can be used for other purposes as well. So this basically compromises, the application's integrity and all. And, the data from that application or code from that application gets exposed essentially to the bad guys. This is what they want to do when they want to perform reconnaissance on your system. So fortunately, there is this is very early on. It's just very hot off the press, so there's no score associated with it. There no CVSS score, but of course we've rated it, at a 64% risk that it might cause into your environment. It has, almost like Kubernetes, as you know, has almost like 91% footprint in production environments. So it makes the entire environment vulnerable. So this is why I have picked Kubernetes.
And I guess I know we've talked about in general, there's a assumption perhaps with container tools that they are more inherently secure, which is probably being disproven.
Yes. The very important one when we look at it in the next, vulnerability here is, somehow people believe, that Docker container is up for only a short period of time. It's got small lifespan, but so somehow, just because of that reason, the attacker cannot persist in your environment. Nothing could be farther from the truth out there. All the attacker needs is a few seconds. And if you happen to be alive, that container happens to be alive in those few seconds, they can persistently install themselves on the host and completely take over your host. And then, once your host has been taken over, there's no guarantees anymore. It's like a piece of malware. It kind of beacons home all the time. and then the bad guy can come in at any point in time. So you're kind of at the bad guy's mercy at that point.
Right.
So all it takes is a few seconds.
Okay, and I guess so that's the next step. We can talk about this one with Docker.
Yes. So ViewNet is an open source piece of software. What it does is it basically allows you your software to create a virtual network within your own environment. So these days, as we talk about SD-WAN and there's no hardware. In the traditional case, you used to have switches and fabric. The network and switching fabrics were based out of specialized hardware, but now people create it out of x86 machines, general purpose x86 machines that you'd find in a data center. And so when you run this piece of software, it kind of allows you to connect data to flow from application A to application B. And so this particular vulnerability is a command injection vulnerability. It, if once the attacker has exploited this vulnerability, they'll get access to the host essentially. So at that on which the Docker container is running. So that's really nasty stuff because once now, as we were talking a few minutes ago, that once the attacker has access to the host, game's up at that point.
Right.
That split second in which the attacker sent the bad traffic, and moments later the malware got installed. That's all it takes. In less than 100 milliseconds, you're now a victim at that point, and a persistent victim. You can come back. The attacker can come back at any point in time, and as long as the host has not been wiped, the attacker can keep coming back.
And that seems like an important point. So if you corrupt the host that's running containers, it's still you have persistence.
Exactly. Just like in the SolarWinds case, the bad guys were able to come again and again, because they had installed a piece of malware that was beaconing home all the time. They were able to get back in there through the hole that they managed to create essentially.
Okay.
So
and
fortunately,
we address this through our VSP web. We're able to detect and stop these
it's a command injection vulnerability that we can actually protect through through the VSP web. So the environment, the Kubernetes environment, can be protected. If there's a remote management interface through which the good guys or the IT ops would come in, that path would get protected by VSP web.
Okay.
My third pick is IBM's Guardium. IBM's Guardium product is meant to protect databases against DLP-like capabilities and make sure all the requests that are going in are legit. And so in many ways, this is almost like a confused deputy, but I kind of fell short of that because its charter is to protect the database, but and it's very extensively used in Fortune 100 companies. Fortunately, even though its score is very high, 7.8, but there's no public exploit available at this moment, or at least that's what we think. But we shouldn't be playing Russian roulette out here, as we said, right? So we should be able to put our VSP web in front of this application. In that way, the vulnerability on either the application or the security controls, in this particular case, the IBM Security Guardium, would also be mitigated.
Okay.
My fourth pick is Zoho, a managed engine. So recently, the gentleman who is the CEO of Zoho has, gone back and, through the pandemic, he realized that, he could run the company from anywhere. And he was of South Asian descent in India, actually. So he went back and started provided employment to a whole bunch of people in India, in rural India. In a village. So he actually put up his headquarters in a village, and it's really an uplifting story to tell. But that's a whole different ballgame out there. But this particular product, Manage Engine, is used to manage IT ops. So it's used to gauge the health of various endpoints on which the client of Manage Engine client is installed. And also it is used to deploy new software. So if I were to deploy some new software across the enterprise, I'd use a product like Manage Engine for that. So imagine if I could take over Manage Engine, I could deploy anything on anybody's computer at that point in time, right? I could plant all kinds of malware that I wanted to be able to plant. So this is the reason why I picked this vulnerability, and for rightly so, the NVIDIA has rated it at a very high number, 8.8. And I completely agree, and I would have actually rated it even higher, for the damage that it can do.
Yeah, I'm curious, Satya. It's an interesting point. The ability to propagate, one point of attack to thousands. That seems like, in light of solar winds, it seems like something that a lot more attention should be paid to.
Exactly. And these common pieces of software that run across the data center have the same effect as a supply chain.
Sure.
So they're a big force multiplier in many ways. They can touch, because they touch hundreds and thousands of servers. They'll make not just different companies, but different servers in that enterprise vulnerable in one go.
So maybe we need a new term like confused deputy for security tools for enterprise
and monitoring tools.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this category of tool like Active Directory, for instance, right?
Right.
I should say directory servers, I shouldn't pick out on Active Directory here. But with the directory servers, it's a very common thing. Every server has a connection to the directory server. And same thing with email agents and all, right? Or LDAP, email, authentication, monitoring. These are all very common. DNS, NTP. These are services that are needed by every server. So if you find a vulnerability in any one of those kind of services, that's really, really very interesting. And we'll be touching on in the next week. We'll be touching on one such vulnerability that affects sudo capability. So it came out just a day or two ago. So we'll be covering that in the next week. That has the legs of, it'll spread, I predict that, in the next few weeks, it'll become really, really nasty problem to solve for everybody.
Yeah, interesting.
So this is, again, because it's a SQL injection attack, we could actually protect it with our VSP web capabilities. So, something like manage engine in the enterprise would not be accessible over to a remote user, because it would get protected by VSP web.
Okay.
My fourth vulnerability of the week is Prestashop. Prestashop is a very important, very common e-commerce platform that is used, that runs PHP, but it's almost every small to medium business will use that to perform their e-commerce operations and all. And so, in one fell swoop, like we have out here in this risk impact paragraph, 300,000 e-commerce shops across the world that are using Prestashop as their template would get exposed. And, this one, unfortunately, has a vulnerability that's out in the open. So it's going to get exploited very big, and especially because, smaller companies don't necessarily have the means or the ability to sort of protect themselves. They don't have a very strict IT oversight. I'm just, I feel, sorry for how it will shake out for all of these people.
Yeah, so this one really has tentacles to huge numbers.
Yes, and again, it was a SQL injection attack. We have a demo that's coming up, Willie. You will see that in the, we'll be putting it up alongside of this. And one of the things that we do out there in that demo is to be able to read the entire database and tables, and then actually use extract usernames and their passwords and all. So, as part of an exploit, this can be a very nasty thing. Your database is completely exposed to anybody. So there's nothing available in your database that you can actually end up holding. There's no sanctity left in that database essentially at that point.
Okay.
My fifth vulnerability that I picked for the week is the Oracle. There were, as you remember from our opening statement, there were almost like 130 odd, vulnerabilities in Oracle. So, this came like a fire hose, out of the fire hose. So I picked just one of them. Again, this one suffers from a remote coding execution problem, our favorite, RCE. And so, the attacker is capable of installing any piece of software once they exploit the RCE. So this particular vulnerability has been associated with the, by the NVD with a 9.8 rating. And fortunately, there's no exploit available in the open, but that doesn't mean that there's somebody out there who doesn't know at all anything at all about it. And in fact, by doing a little bit of snooping, it's very easy to create the vulnerabilities out here, or the exploit vectors out here. So I would say either patch it or deploy. And there's not enough detail available in the NVD. But this is one of those cases where it's very widely used. It's one of those top 1,000 enterprise will definitely have one or two of their footprint. Many of our customers use that for sure. But there's no attribution yet to any particular CW. It just simply turns into ability. It gives the bad guys the ability to launch new processes or unfamiliar processes at the endpoint. So our VSP host will make sure that the application control capabilities of VSP host will ensure that unauthorized processes don't get spawned.
Okay, so another example of remote code execution, which we're seeing more and more, right?
Exactly. And we can touch a little bit about there's this piece of Linux malware that's going around these days. It's called freakout malware. Mm-hmm. So as part of our kill chain, the attacker would infiltrate using this vulnerability and then install the freakout malware. And that would be by chaining those things together, you'd actually add this is the power of RCE, as we were talking about the other day. Right. That an RC is like opening the door, and to whoever is on the street, they can come in and plunder whatever is inside, I guess. And my confused deputy of the week is Cisco AMP. So this is a really classic problem, where one of the files that gets loaded in this in the code is really the code doesn't check where it's getting loaded from, or as long as it meets a name requirement. That file will get loaded in memory. And once that file gets loaded, a DLL, all it needs to have is a DLL init section in it, and that section will execute. So I can make this vulnerability, this particular application do pretty much anything. So, this is again one of the reasons why we picked this as a secure confused deputy is people are hoping and praying that, the AMP, a product like AMP will protect them. But, by using a DLL hijack attack, which is a very simple attack to carry out. There are only so many DLLs that are present. You just have to try it out one by one, and an attacker who's willing to spend a few hours investigating will find this vulnerability, even though there's nothing publicly disclosed. But this is the kind of thing attackers will find very, very quickly. And so this one has a vulnerability score of 7.8. But I would say that the reason, one of the reasons why it has a 7.8 is because there's no public exploit. But like I mentioned, all it takes is a few hours from an attacker to construct an exploit like this. And so in our case, with Virsec, if it were, if the Cisco AMP was being used on a server that was in a data center, we'd actually be able to make sure that that could not be used to as a pathway to launch malware on that particular server. So VSP host would actually block this attempt to perform a DLL hijack attack on this server.
Can I ask Satya a little more broadly about DLL hijacks? It seems like a kind of a blind spot for a lot of security products. Is it because they're overlooked or they're not being monitored during runtime?
So it's really a very tricky problem. How do I know, where there's a lot of, the problem is that, you're trying to load a library to, to secure the particular product, right? It's like, you're getting some ingredients to cook a meal, for instance, right? You're kind of assuming that those ingredients are safe and, that they won't cause, problems as you eat them, right? So you're kind of postulating for a moment that everything's all kosher out there. But here, in this particular case, if the attack is, if there is a DLL hijack attack here, then the ingredient itself is, is kind of like almost like a salmonella kind of an attack, right?
Or poison.
Not really expecting, yes. So it's ingesting poison, and there's no way to tell that you're ingesting poison at the time you're about to put it all together.
Right. So, and then maybe just briefly, part of our VSP host capabilities is we map the acceptable DLLs along with a wide range of other things we map.
Yes, that's one of the several app maps that we have. We know exactly what DLL will get loaded, and we have a signature for that particular DLL. None of this would have happened, just by simply by manipulating directory paths and the names of the executable. You may not be able to load any weird DLL or into the process. So that's what this is all about.
And as always, we highlight most weeks a confused deputy, meaning it's a security tool that can be corrupted or potentially disabled or hijacked, and that has broad implications, obviously, if you're trusting that product.
Exactly.
All right, Satya, well, thank you as always. I think we have got a lot to chew on here. I will mention on our Bright Talk channel and on our website, you can see a new demo of step-by-step end-to-end how SolarWinds was perpetrated, put together by Satya's research team, and how Virsec is able to stop that attack kill chain. So again, thank you, Satya, and thank you to the audience, and we will see you again next week.
Thank you very much.